Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Investiture lecture and celebration of our wonderful colleague, Matiangai Sirleaf. I'm Peter Danchin, Associate Dean for Research and Faculty here at the Law School. Investiture lectures are a core part of the intellectual life and fabric of the school, and a moment, I think, really just to pause, to reflect, and to celebrate the long-term trajectory and excellence of the work of our faculty. The Dean of the Law School, Renee Hutchins, is in New York today for a Board of Visitors meeting, but she's recorded a video to welcome you all this afternoon and to congratulate Professor Sirleaf on this great moment in her academic career. So we're going to begin this afternoon's proceedings with that video.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the investiture of our esteemed colleague, Matiangai Sirleaf, as the Nathan Patz Professor of Law. I am deeply disappointed that I can't join you in person to celebrate Professor Sirleaf, but I am glad to have the chance to share just a few thoughts with you. Professor Sirleaf is a leading scholar in an astonishing range of pressing areas. They include public international law, international human rights law, global public health law, post-conflict and transnational justice, international criminal law, race and criminal law, and social justice in the law. She has been on the Maryland Carey Law faculty since 2020, and in that short time, her accomplishments have been remarkable. In the past 3 years, she has published articles in the UCLA Law Review, Columbia Law Review, and the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics, as well as several book chapters. She has also been elected to serve leadership positions during her tenure here at Maryland Carey Law, including an executive editor at Just Security and a member of the Board of Editors of the American Journal of International Law. This year, she was awarded a secondary appointment as a professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, where she teaches global public health. And in her spare time, just last month, her book, Race and National Security, was published by Cambridge University Press. As an editor of this groundbreaking volume, Professor Sirleaf brings together the work of top scholars to challenge conventional interpretations of national security and to reconceive the role of race in national security. The project is part of a partnership between Oxford University Press and Just Security. Professor Sirleaf's work is highly impactful, and her national and international claim is increasing all the time. As a scholar, a teacher, and an admired colleague, she brings vital perspectives and brilliant critical thinking to our collective conversation. We are incredibly fortunate that she is part of the Maryland Carey Law community, and I want to say that I personally think that we are better because she is among us. Finally, I want to share a little background on Professor Sirleaf's endowed professorship, which is named for a 1926 graduate of the law school, Nathan Patz. Mr. Patz worked as an attorney in Baltimore for more than 70 years until he passed away in 1998. He specialized in corporate law, litigation and estates, and trust planning and administration. He continued to practice law into his 90s. He was described as a great legal leader and an outstanding citizen of Maryland. Mr. Patz and his family generously supported the law school before and after his death, and we are grateful for their investment in our students, faculty, and broader law school community. It is with great pleasure that I congratulate Professor Matiangai Sirleaf on her investiture as the Nathan Patz Professor of Law. I hope that you will all enjoy the evening, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Okay, well, it now gives me great pleasure warmly to welcome to the law school and introduce Professor Guy-Uriel E, who's the Charles Ogletree Jr. Professor of Law and Faculty Director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law School. Professor Charles is going to make some introductory remarks and introduce both Professor Sirleaf and her lecture this evening on hierarchy and international law. Professor Charles.
Thank you so very much. I am so absolutely delighted and more than pleased to be here this evening to celebrate and honor Professor Matiangai Sirleaf. I commend the law school on its wisdom and perspicacity and honoring her, but also honoring itself with this distinguished professorship. For those of you who've had the pleasure of reading and engaging with Professor Sirleaf's work, you would notice, and really in many respects, given the volume of the work, more than a dozen articles, book chapters, and a new book, I don't think it does service to describe it as a work or the work. I think one has to change languages and go to French and to call it an oeuvre. It is an oeuvre, which then helps us to know that it is distinguished and the pretension is worthy of the distinction. So I will be talking about Professor Sirleaf's oeuvre because of its thoughtfulness and the depth of the work. And the different characteristics that it brings to bear, and spending some time with the work in preparation, the oeuvre, in preparation for this introduction, I noticed three remarkable characteristics. She is a scholar with a very, very wide-ranging intellect. The dean talked about the various fields that Professor Sirleaf covers. Her range is indeed quite remarkable. And here I must confess a bit of jealousy and her ability to, in an interdisciplinary way, make contributions across so many different domains. So I'm a scholar of law and democracy. I know one thing. I would hope and believe that I know that one thing very well, but it is the one thing that I know. By contrast, Professor Sirleaf knows a lot and an in-depth way about a lot of different things. Indeed, I had to write them all down, and I will simply duplicate what you've already heard, but I think it is worthy of some attention. So there's health law that is not just about health law, but is about science. For those of you who are lawyers, I don't know about you. I went to law school to avoid medicine, not to engage it in an in-depth way, to avoid a secondary appointment at a school of medicine, not to have it bestowed upon me. So I don't know very much about science, but obviously she does, to both be worthy of that secondary appointment, but also when you read her work and she's engaging in not just the law of health, but talking at an expert level about the science. She is an expert in both international law and international human rights law. So one lesson that I had to learn is that there is indeed a difference between the two. They're two distinctive things, international law and national human rights law. She is an expert in criminal law, as well as international criminal law. She is an expert on the law of transitional justice and conflict. She is an expert on, let me see if I could read. Oh, yes, that's right. I shouldn't forget this. Race and law. And I'm sure I've left something behind. And as I'll note in a moment, when you read her work, it is tremendously illuminating how she weaves in so much of those areas of expertise. So the range is deeply impressive. It is like watching the Jean-Baptiste, who shows a similar range with music, jazz, classical, blues, country. It doesn't make any difference. He could take it, he can turn it, he can blend it. That's what we have with Professor Sirleaf. She is a virtuoso. The work also reflects a deep and profound intelligence. My favorite scholars are the ones who bring to the table a perfect blend, a mixture of intellectual subtlety with an unrelenting intellectual ferocity. They help you to see things that you wouldn't otherwise see, and they help you to appreciate things in a way that makes it unavoidable to appreciate them. And it's that blend of subtlety and ferocity that I always find deeply compelling, and both a young and a mature scholar, and Professor Sirleaf's work has those things in spades. And lastly, she brings to the table and her scholarship a moral clarity that is accompanied by a significant and deep ambition to her normative projects. Normative projects have this moral aim, and they're widely ambitious and elegant. And in many respects, her normative aim and her work, at least as I've read it and interpreted it, is to really make the international legal order more just. Now, one can't have a more ambitious project than that. It's not just to look at, so I look at domestic law of American democracy, but she is not, it can't be limited to the domestic. It has to look across, she has to look across borders and think about the whole international legal order and all of its various dimensions, and then to ask, how can we make that more just? I'm just going to say, I've presented the work in its general terms, but I just want to provide one specific, so that way you're not just taking my word if you haven't had a chance to read the full body of her scholarship. And hopefully, as a way of setting up what you're going to hear, certainly my descriptions will pale in comparison to her articulation of her projects. But let me just take a quick minute to focus on one particular piece entitled Racial Valuation of Diseases, which is a piece that addresses the way that different types of diseases are racialized and are given value, and that society attaches value to how they approach and deal with diseases depending upon the particular racial hierarchy that attends to the disease. And the point that she makes is that to help us have an understanding, a better understanding of when people believe that diseases matter. They're not just looking at the disease itself, but they're also influenced by the groups, the racialized groups that they believe are affected or not affected by that disease. And the work engages in the wide-ranging display that I talked about. It is health law, it is race and law, it brings social science, it brings science, it is international, it is comparative. So you see all of the blend of everything into the work with a lot of different literatures and a lot of different legal systems to bear. The subtlety is so elegant. So she talks about not just a racialized hierarchy and structural racial discrimination, but how that racialized hierarchy and structural discrimination interacts with a racialized conception of diseases and how that gets valued. Right? That level of subtlety and the payoff for that subtlety is, in fact, quite significant. So the distinction is subtle. The distinction, it is also supple, and it is also significant. It helps us to understand why some diseases are framed in a particular way and are responded to in a particular way by contrast to others. It helps us to understand the downstream effects, as well as what types of solutions might be useful for thinking about these sets of problems. So her characterization of the framework has significant payoffs for our ability to address not just structural racial inequality, but how that interacts with health disparities and the way that health disparities themselves are racialized. So I want to close with what I have perceived. I've had the privilege of watching and seeing Professor Sirleaf from the very beginning of her career. I have seen the fact that her work, indeed, I think the word that I can describe it, really shimmies with fierceness. I think that's the best description. There's a type of a conviction that is deeply reflected in the work. She has the ability, like a chemist even, and sometimes maybe even an alchemist, to seamlessly and even imperceptibly blend together a number of different frames, literatures, possibilities, to help and teach us something deep about our world. There was a time in which Professor Sirleaf was a young scholar with promise. I've watched her in that moment. There was a time. There was a time in which she was the shiny new thing on the block, not just a young scholar with promise, but one who is clearly inhabiting and delivering on that promise. But the shiny new thing on the block. Professor Sirleaf, I hate to tell you, but you're no longer the young scholar with promise or the shiny new thing on the block. You are a chaired professor of law at one of the best law schools in the country. You're no longer the shiny new thing. You are a sage. You are a wise one, a wizened one. You have ascended to the ranks of the senior scholars. You are now the people that we look to guide us in resolving some of the most pressing problems in our world. You have been elevated to the ranks of those who believe they know and in fact know that everybody now follows, who now points out and says, here are the new shining things. Here are the new ones with promise. You are the one that people look to and say, oh, it's Professor Sirleaf. I've always wanted to meet her. And hopefully will deign to look at the young folks and give them the time of day. Chaired Professor Sirleaf. It is my pleasure to usher you in to the ranks of the senior scholars as you rightfully take your place as one of our brilliant lights. I introduce to you officially Professor Sirleaf, the Nathan Patz Professor.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness, Guy, you're too much. And I have to say, this is a full circle moment for me. Guy, with all of his gravitas up here, I have to tell you, get off script for a little bit. I have to tell you how I met Guy. I was a fellow, as you mentioned, a very lowly young fellow. And I got a phone call in my office one day, and this person is just peppering me with questions. This question, that question. Where am I with this? Where am I with that? Where's my research agenda? Where's my paper? Where's my this? Where's my that? And I'm answering all these questions, and I get off the phone, and then I realize I don't know who I've been talking to the whole time. I don't know who I've been talking to the whole time. And so Guy is not, he has been a mentor from the very beginning. He's not mincing words when he says that. He really has. He's had an influential role in every single professional decision that I've made, even non-professional decisions. He's offered his unsolicited advice, including when I told Guy, my mentor, that I was engaged, and his first concern was what timing the wedding would be, because he was afraid that it might interfere with my going on the market. So that's Guy for you. And I would like to say, as he's ushered me into this, I guess, oldness, I don't know what just happened, but anyway, I would like to say that in this full circle moment that I am now in a different positionality where I'm not owing Guy a paper, but that would be a lie. I still owe Guy a paper, and I'm gonna get you the paper. I'm gonna get you the paper. Thank you guys so much for such a welcome introduction. Thank you to the University of Maryland for bestowing me with this honor. Thank you to my friends and family and colleagues who've showed up on this not late, but seemingly late afternoon. I want to begin by acknowledging Indigenous peoples past and present and future as the rightful and traditional protectors and caretakers of their native lands in now what we know today as the United States. I recognize the historical, ongoing, and violent legacy of land theft initiated by settler colonialists who first invaded the Chesapeake region in the 17th century. Specifically, this law school operates on the ancestral lands of Arawakian-speaking and Algonquian-speaking peoples, all of whom share this area through their relations and whose descendants are thriving despite settler occupation. I also want to acknowledge the people forcibly kidnapped and sold from Africa who were enslaved on these lands. From the colony's founding in 1634 until 1864, when the state of Maryland abolished slavery, enslaved Africans were exploited and did work on this land, enabling us to live as we do today. It's important to acknowledge the continuing forms of injustice in our world, and that the comfort that we have rests upon the suffering of others. Historical and ongoing systems of oppression have perpetuated and obfuscated the acts of political, social, economic, ecological, and racial violence. Acknowledging the fundamental role that these acts have and continue to play in the contemporary harms and subordination that Indigenous, Black, and other people of color face is vital. Recognizing these interconnected injustices serves as an opening to contemplate the continuing resistance to subordination through various social movements aimed at creating equitable relations that honor and heal communities and the land. In this talk, I will discuss my work in the interconnected areas of international criminal law, transitional justice, global health, national security, racial justice, and human rights. It is a mouthful. But my work, as Guy mentioned, is animated by making visible the hierarchy that's embedded and reflected in international law, whether that's looking at the tension between international and local efforts, the privileging of one mechanism over another, how violence and peace are defined, privileging civil and political rights over and above social and economic rights, or racialized hierarchies. I seek to unearth and trouble hierarchies and remedy inequities engendered by these hierarchies. I am a scholar who thinks that it's important that we take positionality seriously, and I see this as an opportunity to reflect on my position as a Black woman scholar writing in international law. I want to first focus on what led me to do the work that I do, instead of hiding behind disciplines and scholarly articles. This, in turn, I believe, will help to make my work more legible. I came to understand the importance of international law as a young child. My family is from Liberia, and growing up there had an incredible impact on me. One of the most formative and lasting experiences of my life occurred during the Liberian Civil War. I remember as a child trying to make sense of what was happening. I remember vividly going from thinking that this was a big sleepover with friends and family to understanding quickly as we hid from the sounds of war that we were seeking shelter, security, and solace in each other. That I had been in a position of privilege to say that I didn't want to eat this or that. But we were now rationing food, and I was begging for leftovers. I also remember asking my mother what ethnicity that I should say I was if I was asked by a militant. My mother is the descendant of formerly enslaved peoples who are termed Americo-Liberians. My father is from a large ethnic group in West Africa, Mandingo. I knew enough about the history of Liberia to understand that membership in both groups was not ideal. One, because of a history of settler colonialism, and the other because Mandingos are viewed as outsiders having immigrated into Liberia from Guinea over the past 200 or 300 years. When we fled Liberia, I remember seeing death and destruction on the path to the US Embassy and understanding early on that my ability to leave family and friends behind was conditioned on things that I had no control over. Status, hierarchy, and privilege were determinative. Things like where I was born, my ethnicity, my race, my class, all of these things had a material impact on my chances in life. I learned early on that constructions like my nationality and having citizenship in the imperial core and my immediate family members having papers and green cards to the US meant that we could leave where others could not and had to stay on the periphery. My rights, my freedoms, my security, and my chances were contingent and based on arbitrary things not within my control. We were all that we had. My lived experience during the war was law in its absence. Where were the rules that were to protect people's rights? Where were the peacekeepers? Where was international law and the so-called international community? And why had it and them seemingly abandoned and forgotten us? Of course, I didn't have the language to articulate any of this as a child, but these questions have guided my scholarly agenda in thinking about the accountability and responsibility gaps that exist in international law. Anthony Angie and others have chronicled how international law facilitated human rights atrocities, supporting imperialism, colonialism, and the transatlantic slave trade. For much of history, international law did not concern itself with the welfare of human beings. Only states were the exclusive subjects of concern for international law, and only some people qualified to be states. Those deemed outside the family of quote-unquote civilized nations, which included much of the globe, were conveniently not able to make or change international law. Virtually no legal restrictions were placed on the actions of states towards indigenous peoples and the taking of land from native peoples. Doctrines like terra nullius and other inventions ostensibly created territories without masters, where indigenous peoples had existed for millennia. Principles like state sovereignty were developed to leave unchecked what the sovereign did to those residing in their territories. Those subject to foreign occupation and rule were not able to call on international law to save them. Moreover, principles like non-interference in the internal affairs of other states limited what one state could say or do concerning the sovereign affairs of another state, especially as it related to how it treated those within its jurisdiction. The veil of statehood then was essentially impermeable as a matter of international law for much of history. International law both created and reified hierarchical relations. As Ruth Gordon has argued in her formative work, international law tends to frame hierarchy in terms of economic strength, military power, or technological advancements. Terms such as North-South, developed-developing, or Third World are the preferred terms of reference. Nonetheless, the Southern developing Third World is, for the most part, the colored world, and like the colored world in the United States, she argues, it is marginalized, disproportionately poor, and relatively powerless. My research can be categorized as critical international legal scholarship. Specifically, much of my writing falls in the third world approaches to international law tradition. 12 scholarship reconsiders the history and development of international law and highlights the colonial legacy of it. It is marked by sincere and concern for the peoples of the Third World and the decolonization of North-South relationships embedded in international law. The common thread through all of my scholarship, whether examining issues of racial justice, civil and political violations, or social and economic violations, is responsibility. International law conceives of responsibility in narrow ways, and my scholarship seeks to render it more emancipatory. I will first discuss my work in international criminal and transitional justice, and then I will discuss my work in global public health, national security, and if we're still here, my most recent work on racial justice and human rights. My interest in international criminal law and transitional justice should be evident. They were informed by my experiences during the Civil War in Liberia and the desire to see accountability and justice realized. These fields seek to reckon with legacies of widespread or systemic human rights abuses, and I approach them with initial zeal and optimism about their transformative power. This area of my scholarship proposes context-specific and locally informed approaches to providing redress to survivors of human rights violations. In pieces like the Truth About Truth commissions, I conclude that much more experimentation needs to be done to formulate effective and contextually appropriate responses to mass violence instead of the one-size-fits-all approach. Although international law is universal in its aspiration, it does not reflect the diverse heritage of historically subordinated peoples in numerous ways. As many countries in the Global South gained independence after the international legal system was already formed, in projects like the African Justice Cascade, regionalism, regime complexes, and international criminal justice, and a regional approach to transitional justice, I argue for the need to take a regional approach to matters of international criminal law and transitional justice. These interconnected projects make a normative case for African and other actors in the Global South to play a substantial role in global rulemaking, in part due to the limitations of both domestic and international institutions. I became disillusioned with the fields of international criminal law and transitional justice in my work in these spaces, in part because of the reflexive and uncritical way many of these projects carry out international law's civilizing mission, which unproblematically relies on stereotypes regarding the inherent violence and inferiority of those targeted for prosecution and the like. The narrow target of these interventions may result in catching individual small fry, but letting the big fish loose, like institutions and corporations and regional and geopolitical powers. In addition, international law constructs and signifies violence in very narrow ways that further structural inequality. Many accountability mechanisms are aimed primarily at securing negative peace, the absence of violence, and the cessation of hostilities. Yet the concept of positive peace encompasses not simply the removal of physical violence, but also the removal of structural violence, which means that we have to consider the importance of not just observable, but also latent violence. There's a pressing need to alleviate not only the injustices caused by a conflict, but also the injustices that cause the conflict. And in societies that have experienced a recent history of conflict, and even those that have not, the insecurity and instability that may result from structural violence merit close attention from a social justice perspective as well. The focus of accountability mechanisms neglect the importance of the restructuring of economic and social sectors, amongst others. In West Africa, this rendered already vulnerable countries ill-equipped to deal with the Ebola outbreak. My interest in global health was informed by me seeing the ravaging impact of HIV and AIDS, Ebola, cholera, and other infectious diseases. I started writing in this space to undermine simplistic accounts where epidemics like Ebola just happened spontaneously, like manna from the sky, or at most due to local backwardness. My research in global health has focused on analyzing the disproportionate distribution of highly infectious diseases and the role of international law in facilitating this result. For example, in Ebola Does Not Fall from the Sky, I draw attention to the differential risk for infection in the Global South and among those already infected for adverse consequences, including death, injury, and illness. I analyze the ways in which international actors can facilitate conditions for structural violence by examining the international public health, the international financial, and peace and security regimes. I discuss the relationship between infectious diseases and conflicts and talk about the need for the more robust attention to this area. in ways that we're seeing play out and reinforce glaringly on our phones daily. I began to examine the limits of the law governing international responsibility and concluded that we needed shared international responsibility norms. And so, in responsibility for epidemics, I helped to develop some of these norms of responsibility that I found needed further elaboration. In my responsibility for epidemics piece, I am focused on how the traditional framework of responsibility in international law is lacking, as well as emerging norms, because they perpetuate the fallacy that states can, on their own, cope with the increased incidence of epidemics and fail to adequately allocate responsibility. I argue for a new vision of responsibility in this project. Specifically, I argue that the common but differentiated responsibility principle be extended from international environmental law to challenges posed by global public health law, to recognize special situations of need, to assign greater responsibility to those who have contributed more, and to assign greater responsibility to those who have more resources and capacity to deal. I have been very fortunate to provide useful guidance to state and other actors contemplating global health law reform, especially the African group of states, who are helping and hoping to shift extant conceptualizations of responsibility in novel ways today. My scholarly contributions in this project have helped to shape advocacy for a more egalitarian mechanism for international responsibility in global health. In responsibility for epidemics, I was not fully able to explore what motivates a state and non-state actors to address highly infectious diseases. And as Guy mentioned, in my racial evaluation of diseases piece, I picked up on this inquiry. I examined how race and racial populations impacted by a given disease influence assessments of when it is in the best interest of institutions, laws, individuals, and society to act. Racial evaluation as a concept refers to how differing values are assigned socially to an individual or group based on their racial designation and the position within the social hierarchy that status implies. This project develops a theoretical framework for racial evaluation and examines how historical and scientific construction of race influence the emergence of racial evaluation norms. In my research on the racialization of disease, I capture how racialized fears of contagion in the United States manifested with children of African immigrants in Dallas taunted as Ebola kids. 2 students from Rwanda, 2,600 miles from West Africa, were sent home from a New Jersey elementary school for 21 days. Additionally, a Texas college sent out letters to prospective students from Nigeria, informing them that they were no longer accepting applications from countries with, quote, confirmed Ebola cases. This is despite the fact that the World Health Organization had declared Nigeria Ebola-free. A middle school even placed a principal on paid administrative leave for a week for attending a funeral in Zambia, which is 2,770 miles from West Africa, despite it having no cases of Ebola. The Ebola epidemic resuscitated historical images of Black African bodies as uncontainable, as disease-ridden, and sparked racialized fears. This transformed Ebola from a regional disease in Africa to one that concerned countries in the global north, and consequently, the Ebola epidemic in West Africa was converted from an unfortunate situation in a neglected region to a significant public health emergency of international concern. Of course, nothing medically makes one race more vulnerable to Ebola than another, yet the disease was consistently racialized as Black. Bearing witness to the material impact of the harm of the racialization of diseases, and then being gaslit when attempting to write and share your research on this very phenomenon is maddening. Race was everywhere, but also nowhere in analyses. This is the double consciousness of which Du Bois spoke of in The Strivings of the Negro People. The ability to look at oneself through the eyes of others, measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Mikhail Matua elaborates on this double consciousness. He poignantly describes the profound discomfort and alienation that comes from reflecting on the history of international law, which makes me feel as though I am an afterthought to the discipline, as a thing that international law defines, accommodates, exploits, tolerates, and controls. It is their international law, Matua tells us, a discourse that calls and treats me like a savage and strips me of my dignity and humanity. The duality of being an insider-outsider captures the conflict of existing, of being within and without simultaneously. All of this exhausts. Toni Morrison once explained that the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdoms, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing, Morrison tells us. She encapsulates so succinctly the conundrum of being a Black woman scholar and writer. How much time do you dedicate to this additional labor? How much does the unspoken cost impact your ability to do your work? I see part of my work as occupying and taking up space in academic places that my ancestors and foremothers have been historically excluded from. In light of the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the effort by a number of disciplines to decolonize and combat institutional racism within the academy, international law as a field seemingly remains committed to keeping questions of race at the periphery. Much effort has been expended by Black scholars and others to subvert the continued whitewashing of international law in the academy. I have joined these efforts and have several projects that explicitly engage with the role of race and racism in the world today. I'm the editor of Race and National Security, the recently published book by Oxford University Press, through a partnership with Just Security. We will have a full day conference on this important volume tomorrow. You should have gotten programs, I think, outside. But I do want to share a couple of things with you now. The relative absence of race in national security is especially striking when one considers that the Journal of Race Development, which was founded in 1910, was the first academic journal in the United States in the discipline. The Journal of Race Development was subsequently renamed the Journal of International Relations and later became Foreign Affairs in 1922. It is worth remembering how demarcations based on race and empire were explicitly part of the calculus of defining the field's initial contours. In 1935, Du Bois concluded that conflicts like the Italian and Ethiopian War would exacerbate tensions along the global color line. His scholarship and the work of others on race and race relations indicate how foundational a racial analysis is to understanding the world order. As Robert Vitalis has argued, during the first decades of the 20th century in the United States, international relations meant race relations, the problem of empire or imperialism, sometimes referred to as race subjection. That was what preoccupied the first identified professors of international relations. Resurfacing this history is critical to understanding the field and practice of national security today. International law was not concerned with the consequences of the anarchical structure of the world order as it's currently understood and taught, Vitalis argues. Instead, it was focused on the dynamics of domination and dependency among the world's purportedly superior and inferior races. The dominant actors in the field did not sufficiently engage with the scholarship and critical interventions of Du Bois and other contemporaries. The presumption of racial differences as natural and inevitable perhaps tended to background the ways in which race, racialization, and racism function in international relations. Even after World War II, the primacy given to security in international relations and its role as an organizing concept has not been divorced from race. Today, questions of race are still hidden in plain sight, and this volume builds on the voices of those that have demanded that national security engage with the historical and ongoing effects of race and racism. The work of Ruth Gordon, the work of Sahar Aziz, the work of Natsu Taylor Saito, the work of Khalid Beydoun, and so many others. Race and National Security as a volume interrogates what it would mean for the field and concept of national security to take issues of race and racial justice seriously. This volume is groundbreaking because it brings domestic, transnational, comparative, and international law perspectives on race and national security in conversation with each other where they would otherwise not be. Conventional works on national security tend to exclude topics that directly pertain to the security of subordinated groups, such as domestic policing in the United States, systemic racism in US foreign policy and foreign affairs and interventions, or, for example, the biometric surveillance of Afghani people that Margaret Hugh covers in our volume. Contributions in this volume refocus the frame of reference. Pieces that would not be together, putting them together leads to important theoretical and policy insights for reforming and transforming national security. The volume is intersectional in its approach. Several of the contributions engage with race and religion, race and gender, as well as language and other forms of positionality. I'm really honored to see so many of the volume contributors here today, and I look forward to our rich discussion tomorrow. The work that we do in this volume, unearthing what is otherwise hidden in plain sight, demonstrates that foregrounding race, as Du Bois proposed, is a task that is necessary not only for the field of national security, but also for the discipline of domestic and international law more generally. The book is organized around 4 interventions: why race and national security at all, what the scope of national security is, and as a corollary, whose national security. It investigates the imperial boomerang effect, which is a term that's used to capture the way in which empires use their colonies as laboratories for methods of counterinsurgency, social control, and repression, measures which can then be brought back here to the imperial metropolis and deployed against the marginalized, subjugated, and subaltern within, which we are seeing now in the Stop Cop City protests in Atlanta. Beginning necessary discussions on what remedy and redress might entail when race and racial justice is centered in national security is important, and we look to comparative and international perspectives to help us. Finally, the book concludes with my own ruminations on the tremendous possibilities and numerous theoretical and policy implications offered in the volume. The problems identified are so profound and integral that the utility of reforms that tinker around the edges of the national security apparatus seem suspect. I conclude that the security state has deleterious consequences for communities internally and externally, and must be abolished as currently constituted. The only way to limit the excess of the security state is to reduce its footprint in the world. If there is less contact, then there are fewer opportunities for the security state to brutalize and enact violence. I resisted doing this talk in part because I did not want to focus on my past work, as I have much more that I want to do and say. And so I want to leave you with one of the projects that I'm working on right now, which is on human rights and historiography. And in this project, I look at the early rights claims of Black people. And I argue that they were in our material to focus on because Black people had been relegated to the status of property and denigrated as subhuman. If human rights are fundamentally about human dignity, then Black people's struggles to widen the sphere of whose dignity, liberty, and equality should be regarded and who counts as a human being is imperative to understanding the project. Yet the human rights canon does not center the lived experiences of those who were considered less than human, nor their rights claims to be included in the moral community. From just a cursory examination of Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech in 1851, to the I Am a Man declaration of protesters during the 1968 Memphis sanitation strike, it should be evident that Black people have long been articulating rights claims to be regarded as human beings and to be treated with equality, dignity, and respect. This project that I'm working on situates Black people as the paradigmatic universal subject in human rights. Human rights, quintessentially, are the rights that one has because one is a human being. They are universal, as all members of the species of human beings are holders of human rights, by implication. Ultimately, human rights are social constructions. They rest on the social decision to act as if such things existed, and through social action directed by these rights, to endeavor to create and transform the world to conform with this vision. In this project, I'm not interested in identifying yet another chronological beginning of human rights. I'm aware of the dangers inherent in leaping from one historical moment to the other without articulating or attempting to discuss causality or how our norms are diffusing or explaining the influence of political economy. It is noteworthy, however, that the universal human subject in human rights canon, whichever starting point is used in human rights, tends to produce a range of other marginalized subjects which are not included. The obscuring of issues of power, privilege, and race has also meant that there is a discounting of early Black emancipatory efforts in human rights history. The result is that the human rights canon, as taught and disseminated, marginalizes the agency and contributions of Black people in the development of human rights. This project reveals how conventional accounts of human rights genealogy reinforce and entrench racial subordination. Central inquiries of mine in this piece are, what does it tell us about the project of human rights that the documents and revolutions that upheld slavery and did not protect people who were enslaved, nor their descendants, are regarded as foundational in human rights, and that those that centered formerly enslaved people and outlawed slavery do not rank in the mainstream accounts of human rights genealogy. More specifically, where does the Haitian Revolution, a successful revolt of the formerly enslaved, and its independence, and its Constitution of 1805 feature in human rights historiography? Similarly, where does Liberia, the nation founded by formerly enslaved people, and its Bill of Rights in its 1847 Constitution feature in the history of human rights? Where do they rank in the canon with all their imperfections? Instead, we know very well the American and French revolutions and their declarations and the iconic status that they have in the human rights canon. This is notwithstanding the fact that the rights claimed were the rights of men and not of women, were almost exclusively white, concomitant with class and property restrictions on who could claim and assert these rights. Moreover, the United States and France's Bill of Rights are not above or beyond the state and are sovereignty reinforcing, but this has not limited their status in traditional accounts of human rights history. W.E. Du Bois once told us that since lions have no historians, lion hunts are thrilling and satisfactory human reading. And since Black people purportedly had no bards, it has been widely told how American philanthropy freed the slave. His commentary highlights the ways in which those who have the power and privilege of storytelling can deny the agency, lived experiences, and resistance of those othered and racialized. This project takes up Makau Matua's invitation that a historical understanding of the struggle for human dignity should locate the impetus of a universal conception of human rights in those very societies that were subjected to tyranny and imperialism. This project reclaims the time of the Haitian and Liberian Bill of Rights and human rights genealogy, as well as several early rights claims advanced by Black people that were not enacted in law. It's significant to note that due to the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans and colonialism, sizable communities of people of African descent were all across the world. Geopolitical hierarchies have meant that historically, Black people have not been easily able to translate their rights claims into positive law, either nationally, regionally, or internationally. Additionally, since human rights are often declared and claimed before being adopted into positive law, it is imperative to not simply prioritize positive law. By examining certain early rights claims asserted by Black people through ideas, discourses, social movements, as well as rebellions and uprisings, we can learn a lot about the meaning of human rights. Yet when one examines the human rights canon, conspicuously missing from the conventional accounts are the 1920 Declaration of the Rights of the Negro People of the World, put forward by the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the African National Congress's 1923 African Bill of Rights. This silencing and marginalization of rights claims articulated by Black people, even where the rights claims advanced are explicitly transnational and international in nature, furthers hierarchy and racial subordination in human rights. The inability to see Black people's early emancipatory struggles as foundational to human rights limits the vision of who the universal subject is or can be in human rights. And this has profound ramifications for the present day. Several commentators have researched Black internationalism and analyzed how connecting local struggles to broader international human rights advocacy was an important aspect of emancipatory efforts during the Civil Rights Movement, the decolonization movement, and the anti-apartheid movement, amongst others. However, what has not been adequately covered is how even before the development of a formal human rights regime beginning in the 1940s, Black people exercised agency, making and articulating rights claims. These histories, some captured in law, some not, are part of human rights genealogy and deserve to be recognized as such. Their continued marginalization in the human rights canon have real and deleterious effects. For one, it reinforces the idea of human rights as an exclusionary, othering concept, developed for the subjects of the South to become more like the North. Additionally, the relative erasure of Haiti and Liberia and other early rights claims asserted by Black people in human rights historiography undermines the political salience of human rights. Who was entitled to make a rights claim, to have those rights recognized, to vindicate their rights, to insist that those standards be realized, and to attempt to create a world which enables people to enjoy the objects of those rights are imperatives to understand, not simply as a matter of theory, but crucially as a matter of praxis. Perhaps returning to the issue of who the universal subject is in human rights can help us to better understand the chants emanating from the streets around the world in 2020 that all lives cannot matter unless and until Black lives matter. I take seriously the words of Angela Davis that you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. I've tried to do that in my work. My work in the areas we've discussed today, international criminal law, transitional justice, global health, national security, racial justice, and human rights, is animated by making visible and troubling the hierarchy embedded and reflected in international law, and remedying the inequities reflected in it. We began this talk by talking about how instrumental international law was in dispossessing people across the globe. Given this history, can international law also be the vehicle that saves us from dispossession and the hierarchical nature of international law and the international order? It's an open question whether the project of international law can be redeemed from its foundational myths and histories. If there is any hope for redemption, the starting point must include centering excluded subjects, zones, and histories, of which there are many. By centering the marginalized and those whose rights have been systemically denied, by looking at the faces of the bottom of the well, as Derek Bell instructs, perhaps there's a way to tap into the transformative potential. I want to close by ruminating on Ruth Wilson Gilmore's premise that freedom is a place. Freedom is a place that we imagine. Freedom is a place that we make. Freedom is a place that we create. Freedom is a place that we build, and it is a place that we must inhabit. As a child, I thought that international law and the international community would save us. Today, where I sit, looking at the world today, I realize that we are the ones that will save ourselves. It is clear that no one is coming to save us, but we can and we will save ourselves. Thank you for your time. That is really not necessary. Okay, stop. So I think, Peter, I don't know, I'm looking at you. We are, we are close to time, but I think we can take a couple of questions. I don't want to stand between people and food and drinks. I definitely don't want to play that role, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them for a couple of minutes. Yeah, Jaya?
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. This made me very because I'm so interested in the new process and thinking about all different types of rights and thinking about how coming to rights from a different perspective might actually change the way we think about emancipation movements. And I'm just interested in what you've come across so far and how it might push the boundaries of how we think about where we're going, how we think about where we're going to find to improve.
Thank you for that. Maybe I will take a couple questions just so that I can have some more time to think about the answer to that. But that's a great, and I'll come to that. But if there's any other question, I can come to your question, Jaya. Nobody wants to save me. That's fine. No, I mean, I think that your question is spot on because part of what I'm trying to do is address this critique of human rights as something that is sort of othered as Western. It's this, but the understanding of human rights as sort of some Western foreign concept is in part informed by the invisibilizing of the role that Black people have had in insisting and articulating rights claims, right? So I think that it is actually very profound to reorient how we think about the history of human rights and locating it in the space of people who were considered to be property, who literally were not considered human, and thinking about how those rights claims then inform the Human Rights Project and how failing to see the ways in which those right claims actually tell us something about human rights genealogy does a disservice to the larger Human Rights Project writ large. And of course, as you know, through our own discussions, there are a bunch of criticisms of rights claims. One of the things that Matua says that I think is Matua, but of course now I'm forgetting. But one of the things that I think that is profound around rights claims is that, rights are useless. So the critique goes because of the ways in which it obscures a bunch of other things. And focusing on rights rhetoric and the like can be very distracting from other ways of organizing and the like. But for people who never had rights, people who were not even considered to be people, rights are actually really powerful things. And rights and advocating for rights and forcing the world to meet the distance between sort of the reality and the law and the books are what I think gives me hope. Social movements agitating for creating a more just order based on the supposed rights that we are supposed to have, and trying to realize them, I think is the only way. If we think about the early critiques of rights that Bentham and others had during the Enlightenment, was that rights were dangerous. Rights could cause upright. Why are you telling people they have all these rights? Right? There's going to be uprisings and the like. And part of the utility, I think, or the hope I see for rights is the work that it takes to make that vision a reality and the organizing that it takes to make that vision a reality. And so I am very excited about this project. As you saw, I took a lot of time talking about it, but I think that it can tell us something really profound about not only human rights history, but also this current moment that we are in and the backlash that we're facing towards sort of real racial reckoning and transformation. And thank you. I think this means people want to eat and drink. So let's, and I am of the same mind. So let's do that. And I will just invite you to the conference tomorrow and hope that we can continue the conversation there. We can certainly continue the conversation outside, but I would like to invite all of you tomorrow to this fabulous conference where we will be discussing many of the themes from the book tomorrow. So thank you for your time.